The words weren't a thunderclap. They were the slow, quiet drip of water wearing away stone. They came not from Thomas, but from his mother, a woman whose world was corseted as tightly as her waist. Clara May Sinclair stood in the Gable family parlor, a room that always smelled of lemon polish and judgment, and felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks. She was too tall for the room, her shoulders too broad for the delicate, rose-patterned wallpaper. She was, in every way, a disruption to its carefully curated softness. "Clara, dear Mrs." Gable began, her voice a silken blade. "A man needs a wife who is a comfort, a gentle presence." She paused, her gaze flicking over Clara's hands, which were clasped at her waist. They were capable hands, clean and strong, but they were not the pale, idle hands of a parlor ornament. They knew the weight of a water bucket and the resistance of stubborn soil in the vegetable garden. Thomas needs a woman of delicate constitution, one who understands that her strength lies in her softness, her yielding nature. Thomas stood by the mantelpiece, staring at the unlit hearth as if it held the answers to the universe. He wouldn't look at her. He had loved her laughter. He'd once said, because it was loud and honest. He had admired the way she could ride a horse as well as any man, her back straight, her chin up against the Kansas wind. He had loved these things until his mother reminded him that they were not the things a husband desired in a wife. "What she means, Clara," Thomas finally mumbled to the bricks, "is that, well, Mother feels you aren't quite feminine." Feminine? The word hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was the ghost that had haunted Clara her entire life. At 5'10", she'd towered over the other girls since she was 13. Her stride was long and purposeful, not the prescribed, gentle shuffle. She spoke her mind plainly because she saw no value in ornamentation, in language or in life. She could think her way through a problem, reset a dislocated fence post, and bake a loaf of sourdough that would keep a man fed for 2 days. But she couldn't master the art of the blush, the coy glance, the strategic helplessness that seemed to be the currency of her gender. She was told she was handsome, intelligent, capable. She was never, ever told she was beautiful. She was never called delicate. The engagement ring, a small pearl that had always looked undersized on her finger, felt suddenly heavy, a brand of her failure. She didn't cry. Tears, she had learned early, were a sign of the very softness she apparently lacked. Yet they would only bring scorn now. A woman like her wasn't supposed to weep. She was supposed to endure. So she stood straight, her spine a rod of prairie steel, and slowly, deliberately, worked the ring from her finger. She placed it on the polished mahogany table between 2 porcelain shepherdesses. It made a small, definitive click. "I see," she said, and her voice was even, too even, she knew. A proper woman's voice would have trembled. "Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Gable, Thomas." She turned and walked out, not waiting for a reply. She did not slam the door. She closed it softly, a final, bitter act of the very gentility she had just been accused of lacking. The walk home was a blur of dust and shame. The Kansas sun beat down, indifferent. She was 24 years old, and she was, by the standards of her world, utterly and irrevocably insufficient. The days that followed were hollowed out, filled with the whispers of the town and the suffocating pity in her own mother's eyes. The rejection wasn't just about Thomas. It was a verdict on her very being. Every criticism she had ever received coalesced into a single, damning truth: she was not enough, not pretty enough, not gentle enough, not woman enough. Desperation is a quiet thing. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sits in the corner of a room, waiting. For Clara, it waited a week. It watched her go through the motions of mending shirts and kneading dough, her movements mechanical, her mind a wasteland. Then, one evening, as she was bundling old newspapers for the fire, Her eyes fell upon a column tucked away in the back pages of the * Kansas City Star * matrimonial inquiries. She had seen them before. Of course, sad, hopeful little messages from lonely men in faraway places. She'd always read them with a kind of detached pity. Now, she read them with the sharp, painful focus of a fellow traveler. * Widower. 45 of good Christian standing, seeks a comely wife of placid temperament to share his Nebraska homestead. Must be proficient in household duties and of a pleasant appearance. * Pleasant appearance? Clara's mouth tightened. She kept reading. * Young rancher in the Indian Territory. Well established. Desires correspondence with a lady of refinement and beauty. Aged 18, 25. A delicate flower to grace my home. * A delicate flower. She could almost hear Mrs. Gable's voice. Clara looked at her hands again. They could pull a flower from the ground, root and all, but they could never be mistaken for one. She was about to toss the paper into the kindling box when one last notice, small and stark, caught her eye. It was different from the others. The type was plain, the wording blunt. * Luke Remington, Griffin's Bluff, Montana Territory. Widower, 32, owns a small ranch, needs a partner for life's work. No promises of riches, only of honesty and hard ground. Non-smoker, non-drinker, sober habits essential. That was it. There was no mention of a pleasant appearance, no request for a delicate flower or a placid temperament. It was a notice written by a man who measured life in acres and effort, not in sonnets and flirtations. And then came the final 2 sentences, the ones that stopped her breath and made her read the entire notice again, slowly. They weren't even full sentences. They were questions, simple, direct. * Can you bake bread that rises *? Have you ever mended a wooden fence on your own *? Clara stared at the words, the newsprint blurring for a moment. He wasn't asking what she looked like. He wasn't asking if she could play the pianoforte or arrange flowers or flutter her eyelashes. He wasn't asking for softness. He was asking for substance. He was asking for the very things she possessed, the very skills that made her who she was, the very qualities that had rendered her undesirable in Kansas. Can you bake bread? She could practically smell the yeast, feel the satisfying weight of the dough as she punched it down. She could bake bread that would make a starving man weep. She could bake bread that rose high and proud, with a crust that crackled and a center as soft as a promise. Have you ever mended a wooden fence? She remembered the summer a storm had flattened the northern fence line of their property. Her father had been laid up with a bad back, and the hired man was away. She'd spent 2 days under the hot sun, digging new post holes, wrestling the heavy cedar posts into place, hammering the rails until her arm ached and her hands were raw with splinters. She had done it, on her own. For the first time since she had walked out of the Gables' parlor, something shifted inside her. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was a flicker of recognition. Here, in these stark, unadorned words from a stranger 1,000 miles away, was a language she understood. It was the language of work, of capability, of resilience. She tore the notice from the newspaper, her movements quick and decisive. She went to her small writing desk, took out a sheet of her plainest stationery, and dipped the pen in the inkwell. Her hand did not tremble. She thought for a moment, not about how to make herself sound appealing, but about how to answer him with the same blunt honesty he had offered. She wrote, * Mr. Remington. * I have seen your notice. My name is Clara May Sinclair. I am 24 years old and in good health. * In answer to your questions, yes, my bread rises, and I have mended fences. She signed her name, folded the single sheet, and sealed it in an envelope. She didn't add a single word about her character or her loneliness or her broken heart. She didn't describe the color of her hair or her eyes. She let the two affirmative answers stand on their own, as solid and unadorned as fence posts in hard ground. The next morning, she walked to the post office and sent the letter. As the clerk stamped it and tossed it into the bin for the westbound mail, Clara felt the Kansas dust swirl around her ankles. She was not running away from the woman she was. For the first time, she was sending that woman on ahead, into the vast, unknown territory of Montana, to see if, just maybe, there was a place where she might be enough. The journey had scoured her. For 3 weeks, the stagecoach had been her world, a cramped, swaying box of cracked leather and other people's weariness. It had rattled over the plains, forded rivers that threatened to swallow it whole, and climbed through mountain passes where the air grew thin and cold. Clara May Sinclair had felt herself being stripped away, layer by layer. The woman from Kansas, with her specific hurts and familiar sorrows, was worn down to a core of simple, raw anticipation. All that was left was the name Luke Remington and the 2 questions he had asked. When the coach finally groaned to a halt, the driver's call of Griffin's Bluff was a deliverance. Clara pressed her face to the grimy window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw a wide, raw street, a collection of unpainted wooden buildings huddled together against a backdrop of dark, pine-covered hills. A curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. It was a place built of necessity. Not beauty, it was real. She straightened her bonnet, smoothing the travel-creased wool of her dress. Her hands were trembling slightly. Asterisk. He will be here, asterisk, she told herself. A man who wrote with such directness would be a man who kept his word. He would be waiting. The coach door was thrown open, and the world rushed in not with a welcoming embrace, but with a slap of cold, wet air. A steady, miserable rain was falling from a sky the color of dishwater. It turned the street into a churning river of mud, thick and greedy. The smell of wet earth, wood smoke, and damp pine filled her lungs. Clara descended the steps, her boots landing on the relative safety of the wooden boardwalk. She clutched her worn reticule and scanned the platform. A stable boy with hair plastered to his forehead was unhitching the weary horses. The driver, a man whose face was a road map of hard miles, grunted as he began to untie the luggage. There were a few men sheltering under the awning of the building opposite a saloon, judging by the swinging doors, but none of them stepped forward. No tall, quiet man was looking for her. No one was there at all. The small, fragile flame of hope that had burned within her for 1,000 miles flickered and died, leaving behind a cold, familiar ache. He was not here. "Your trunk, ma'am," the driver said, his voice impatient. With a final heave, he wrestled her large, leather-bound trunk from the roof and let it fall. It landed with a heavy, wet asterisk thump asterisk, half on the boardwalk and half in the deep mud, splattering her skirts with brown flecks. "The inn is that way," he said, gesturing with his chin down the street toward a 2-story building with a faded sign. "The Griffin's Roost. Can't miss it." And with that, he turned his attention to the mailbags. His duty to her complete. The stagecoach, her last link to the world she knew, would be gone within the hour. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. The rain began to fall harder, plastering a stray strand of her brown hair to her cheek. For a long moment, she simply stood there, a solitary figure in a gray, weeping world. The sheer weight of her foolishness threatened to crush her. What had she been thinking to leave her home, her family, everything she knew, based on 2 sentences in a newspaper from a man she had never met? A man who couldn't even be bothered to meet her at the station. Then, she looked at her trunk, stuck fast in the Montana mud. It held everything she owned in the world. Her 2 good dresses, her mother's quilt, her father's book of psalms, her sewing kit, her sturdy shoes, her life. If she left it, she would have nothing. If she wanted it, she would have to move it herself. The choice was simple. It was always simple. You either surrendered to the mud, or you found a way to walk through it. Clara took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. She stepped off the boardwalk, her boots sinking instantly, the mud sucking at them with a hungry sound. She gripped the trunk's thick leather handle. It was heavy, far heavier than she remembered, now waterlogged and anchored by the mire. She pulled, her muscles strained, the tendons in her neck standing out. The trunk scraped forward a few inches with a grotesque tearing sound, leaving a deep scar in the street. That was when she noticed the eyes. Until then, the town had been a blur of wood and rain. Now, it resolved into faces. Two women, their arms full of provisions, had stopped outside the mercantile store, their heads together, whispering. A curtain twitched in the window above the assayer's office. The men on the saloon porch had fallen silent, watching her struggle, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and faint, cruel amusement. A blacksmith, his leather apron dark with soot, stood in the wide doorway of his smithy, his hammer idle in his hand. No one offered to help. No one even called out a word of encouragement. She was a spectacle, a woman, alone, tall and wrestling a heavy trunk through a sea of mud. She was not a wife, a mother, or a daughter. She was an anomaly, an unwelcome disruption to the town's rough-hewn order. In their eyes, she saw the question asterisk. What kind of woman travels alone to a place like this asterisk? She knew the possible answers they were turning over in their minds: a desperate spinster, a woman of ill repute, or a fool. Perhaps, she thought with a fresh wave of humiliation, she was all three. The heat rose in her face, a painful, burning flush that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. Her first instinct was to drop the handle, to let her gaze fall to the mud at her feet, to make herself smaller. The lessons of Mrs. Gable and a lifetime of being told she was too much screamed at her to bow her head. But then something else rose up to meet the shame. It was a cold, hard knot of defiance. She had not come all this way to be defeated by mud and whispers. She had been judged in a fine parlor in Kansas and found wanting. She would not be judged by a silent jury on a saloon porch in Montana and accept their verdict. She tightened her grip on the handle. She lifted her chin, her gaze locking for a brief, challenging moment with one of the men on the porch before sweeping past him. She fixed her eyes on the sign for the Griffin's Roost, as if it were the only thing that existed in the world. Step, scrape, suck! Her world shrank to the rhythm of the struggle, the strain in her back, the slick, cold leather of the handle in her palm, the sound of her own ragged breathing. The mud fought her for every inch. It pulled at her boots, splattered her dress, and tried to claim her trunk as its own. But she did not stop. She did not look left or right. She walked a straight line through the gauntlet of stairs, her spine as rigid as a fence post. It felt like an eternity, but it was likely only a few minutes before she reached the inn. She hauled the trunk up the 3 wooden steps, leaving a trail of muddy water behind her, and finally set it down on the porch with a shuddering gasp. Her arms trembled with exhaustion. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The warmth of the room was a shock, thick with the smell of roasting meat, stale beer, and damp wool. A few men sat at a rough-hewn table in the corner. A game of cards halted mid-play. They all turned to look at her. The silence was as complete as it had been outside. A woman with a tired, sallow face and graying hair tied in a severe bun stood behind a long counter, wiping it with a damp cloth. She stopped, her eyes taking in Clara's appearance, the mud-caked dress, the damp hair, the determined set of her jaw. "Help you?" the woman asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of welcome. "I need a room," Clara said, surprised at how steady her own voice sounded. The woman's gaze flickered past Clara to the muddy trunk on the porch, then back. "For how long?" "I'm not certain yet. Just for tonight, to start." "You alone?" The question was direct, probing. "I am," Clara said, meeting the woman's gaze without flinching. The woman considered her for a long moment, then seemed to reach a decision. She slapped the rag onto the counter and pulled a large iron key from a hook on the wall. 50 cents, paid in advance. Clara reached into her reticule, her fingers finding the small coin purse. She laid the coins on the counter. The sound was small but clear in the silent room. "Room 4, top of the stairs, to the right," the woman said, pushing the key toward her. "Supper's at 6. Don't be late." Clara took the key. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. She turned, walked back out onto the porch, and faced her trunk once more. It would take 2 trips, but she would manage. She would not ask for help. Later, in the small, clean room, she finally let go. She didn't weep. She was too tired, too empty for tears. She leaned her forehead against the cool, rough wood of the door and let the full weight of her journey, and its dismal beginning, wash over her. The room was sparse, a narrow bed with a patched quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single window. She walked to the window and looked down. The rain had eased to a drizzle. The street below was mostly empty now, the onlookers having returned to their own lives. Griffin's Bluff looked even grimmer from above, a collection of damp, gray shapes huddled under a vast, indifferent sky. She had arrived. She had made it through the mud and the stairs. But as she stood there, looking out at the town that was meant to be her new beginning, she had never felt more like a stranger in her entire life, and the question that had traveled with her all those miles returned, colder and sharper than before. What if he never comes? Clara woke to the unfamiliar sounds of a town coming to life, the rumble of a heavy wagon on the street below, the sharp ring of a hammer on an anvil from the blacksmith's shop, the low murmur of voices from the common room downstairs. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the previous day washed over her, the rain, the mud, the cold wall of stairs, and she was fully, miserably awake. She lay still under the patched quilt, the lumpy mattress a poor comfort for her travel-sore bones. A pale gray light filtered through the single window. What was she to do? Every instinct screamed at her to pack her trunk, inquire about the next eastbound stage, and flee. She could be back in Kansas in a month, tail tucked between her legs, ready to endure a lifetime of pity and "I told you so's." The thought was so repulsive it was physically painful. The alternative was to stay. But what did that mean, to wait in this room until her money ran out? To wait for a man who hadn't shown up, who might have been a cruel joke, a phantom conjured from newsprint? She felt a hot surge of anger at Luke Remington for his absence, but more fiercely, anger at herself for her own desperate hope. No, she would not wait. Waiting was what women in parlors did. She was in Montana now. She would act. She washed her face in the basin of icy water, the shock of it clearing her head. She put on her sturdiest dress, the dark blue serge, and braided her hair into a tight, practical coronet. When she looked in the small, warped mirror above the washstand, the woman who looked back was pale and tired, with dark circles under her eyes, but her jaw was set. She would not be a victim of her own folly. She would find this Mr. Remington and demand an explanation, and if he had none, she would at least have the satisfaction of looking him in the eye before she turned her back on Griffin's Bluff for good. Downstairs, the innkeeper, whose name she'd learned was Martha, was serving breakfast to a table of grim-faced miners. She barely glanced up as Clara approached the counter. "Good morning," Clara said, her voice firmer than she felt. Martha grunted in reply, sloshing coffee into a thick ceramic mug. "I was wondering," Clara began, forcing herself to keep her tone even, "if you know a man named Luke Remington." The woman's movements paused for a fraction of a second. She set the coffee pot down with a deliberate clink and turned, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes, the color of slate, assessed Clara with a new, sharper interest. "I might," she said, her voice non-committal. "Why are you asking?" "He was supposed to meet me yesterday." The admission felt like peeling a bandage from a fresh wound. Martha's expression didn't soften. Luke Remington ain't one for town business. Keeps to himself. Got a ranch up on the ridge. She looked Clara up and down again. A flicker of something pity, perhaps, or scorn in her eyes. He uses the livery stable out back sometimes, when he comes for supplies. Might try there. She turned away, dismissing Clara as she picked up the coffee pot again. The conversation was over. Clara walked through the inn and out the back door. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy and damp, and the ground was a treacherous landscape of mud and puddles. The livery stable was a large, barn-like structure, its wood weathered to a silver gray. The wide doors stood open, spilling a parallelogram of dim, golden light into the muddy yard. The air inside was thick with the honest, earthy smells of hay, horses, and leather. It was a relief after the stale closeness of the inn. Beams of dusty light slanted down from high, narrow windows, illuminating the motes dancing in the air. A few horses stood placidly in their stalls, their tails swishing, their soft, wet snorts echoing in the quiet. In the center of the stable, a man was bent over, checking the hoof of a large bay horse. His back was to her. He was tall, as his letter hadn't said, but she had somehow imagined, with shoulders that strained the seams of his flannel shirt. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, a man entirely at home with his work. There was a stillness about him, a sense of rootedness that seemed to mock her own frantic uncertainty. This had to be him. She stood just inside the doorway, her heart beginning its frantic rhythm again. This was the man who had asked her if she could bake bread, the man who was either her future or the architect of her greatest humiliation. She swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet barn. "Mr. Remington." Her voice was thinner than she'd intended. The man didn't startle, but his movements ceased. He slowly lowered the horse's hoof, gave the animal a reassuring pat on the flank, and then he turned. He was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said what that was. His face was weathered by sun and wind, carved with lines that spoke of hardship and solitude. It was not a handsome face in the way of Thomas Gable's soft features, but it was strong, composed of angles and planes. His hair was the color of dark earth, and his eyes, she saw as he stepped out of the shadow, were a clear, startling gray, the color of the sky after a storm. They looked at her directly, without artifice, and with an unnerving stillness. He was, she guessed, about the age he'd stated, but he carried the gravity of an older man. He took in her dress, her braided hair, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. His gaze was not appraising, not insulting. It was simply observing, as one might observe a new foal or an unexpected change in the weather. "Clara May Sinclair," she said, forcing the words out. "From Kansas." He gave a single, slow nod. A flicker of something crossed his face, not surprise, exactly, but a kind of deep, quiet astonishment. He looked at her as if she were a letter he had sent long ago and never expected to receive a reply to. "I got your letter," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. He took a step closer, then stopped. "I didn't figure you'd come." "Your letter said to arrive yesterday," she said, a hint of the previous day's anger coloring her tone. "The stagecoach arrives when it arrives. I was told you would be there." He didn't make an excuse. He simply looked at her, his gray eyes steady. "I got delayed on the mountain. A stray calf. I rode in this morning." He looked at her mud-stained hem and the weariness etched onto her face. The townfolk, they weren't kind. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She just lifted her chin. He seemed to understand. He looked away for a moment, toward the horse, as if gathering his thoughts. When he looked back at her, his expression was somber. "I am not a man for many words, Miss Sinclair, and I'm not good at town things." He gestured vaguely toward the main street. "But I am good at keeping the words I make." The simple, unadorned apology settled something in her. It was as honest and direct as his advertisement. He wasn't trying to charm her. He was just telling her the truth. He noticed the slight shiver that ran through her. The stable was cold, and her dress was still damp. His gaze fell on a heavy sheepskin coat hanging from a wooden peg on a stall door. Without a word, he took it down. It was old and worn. The wool collar flattened with use, but it looked clean and warm. He stepped forward and held it out to her. "You're cold," he said. She hesitated for only a second before letting him drape it over her shoulders. It was heavy and far too large, the sleeves hanging down over her hands, but it was blessedly warm, and it smelled of pine smoke, clean wool, and the faint, not unpleasant scent of the man himself. The simple, practical gesture was more of a welcome than any flowery speech could have been. She pulled the coat around her, her fingers curling into the soft wool of the lining. Luke Remington turned and walked to the large stable doors, pushing one open further. He gestured for her to join him. She walked to his side, standing in the doorway, the too large coat a comforting weight on her shoulders. He didn't look at her, but out past the muddy yard, toward the hills that rose sharply behind the town. The clouds were beginning to break, and a pale, watery sunlight was touching the tops of the highest pines. He raised a hand and pointed. On the slope of the nearest ridge, nestled in a grove of aspen trees, was a small, solid-looking cabin with a stone chimney. It was too far to see clearly, but it looked sturdy, anchored to the land. It looked like a place that could withstand a storm. "My place is up there," he said, his voice quiet, matter-of-fact. He finally turned his head, his gray eyes meeting hers. There was no promise of a grand future in them, no hint of romance. There was only a stark, simple offer. "It has a kitchen. The stove draws well." A kitchen, a stove that draws well. In that moment, those words were the most beautiful poetry she had ever heard. He wasn't promising her a life of ease. He wasn't promising to cherish and protect her. He was offering her a place of purpose, a place to work, a place to put down roots. He was offering her the very things he had asked for in his letter, a chance to prove her substance. Clara looked from the cabin on the hill to the man standing beside her, the man with work-stained hands and a quiet, steady gaze. The man who didn't praise her beauty or criticize her lack of it. The man who had met her desperation with a simple, practical need. She pulled the collar of his coat a little tighter around her neck, a silent gesture of acceptance. She would go with him. She would walk up that hill. For the first time since leaving Kansas, she felt the ground beneath her feet. Not as a river of mud, but as something solid she could stand on. The walk up the ridge was not a stroll. It was a climb. The path was a narrow track cut into the hillside, slick with wet leaves and loose stones. Luke led the way, his stride long and steady, never once looking back to see if she was keeping pace. He carried her smaller valise as if it weighed nothing. Clara, her lungs burning in the thin mountain air, followed with her reticule and a carpet bag. Her borrowed coat a heavy, cumbersome weight. She didn't complain. She focused on placing her feet, on the rhythm of her own breathing, on the solid, silent back of the man ahead of her. This, she understood, was the first test. The ranch was not so much a single place as a clearing wrestled from the wilderness. The cabin sat at its center, built of thick, hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. It looked as if it had grown from the earth itself. Behind it stood a sturdy barn, smaller than the livery in town but just as sound, and a series of fenced corrals. The air was clean, smelling of pine and damp soil and the sharp, clean scent of an axe biting into wood. There were no flowers, no garden path, no softening touches. It was a place of work, a fortress of solitude. Luke led her to the cabin's porch and pushed open the heavy plank door. He stood aside to let her enter. The inside was one large room, dim and cool. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A rough-hewn table and two straight-backed chairs stood in the center. Along another wall was a bed, neatly made with a dark wool blanket, and a simple wooden chest. The floor was made of wide, hand-planed boards, worn smooth by years of boot leather. Everything was spare, scrupulously clean, and intensely masculine. It was the home of a man who lived without excess. "This is it," he said, his voice quiet in the enclosed space. He set her valise down by the door. Clara stood in the middle of the room, the heavy coat still wrapped around her. She looked at the single bed, and a knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. Her silence must have spoken for her, because Luke gestured toward a narrow door she hadn't noticed, tucked into the corner beside the fireplace. "That's your room," he said. "It was my wife's. Before—" He didn't elaborate. The single word hung in the air, filled with a history she had no right to ask about. "It's small, but it's private." He led her to it. The room was hardly more than a closet, with a narrow cot, a small window, and a row of wooden pegs on the wall. It was cold and smelled faintly of disuse and dried lavender, a ghostly feminine scent in this overwhelmingly male space. But the door was solid. It was her own. It was more than she could have hoped for. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He gave a slight, awkward nod, as if her gratitude was an unfamiliar currency. He then led her back into the main room, to the area that served as the kitchen. It consisted of a dry sink with a bucket for water, a set of shelves holding a few tin plates and mugs, and a large cast-iron wood stove. "Stove heats the whole cabin," he said, running a hand over its cold, black surface. "The firebox is sound, but the oven—" He opened the oven door with a protesting squeal of rusted hinges. "The thermostat's broken, bakes uneven, burns on one side, raw on the other." He looked at her, his gray eyes direct. "I can fix most anything with wood or leather. Iron, that's a different language." Clara stepped forward, peering into the oven's dark interior. She ran her fingers along the warped metal plate at the bottom. She saw the problem immediately: a broken vent plate and a rusted-out damper control. It was a challenge, not a complaint. He wasn't telling her it was useless. He was showing her the work that needed to be done. He was handing her a piece of his world and waiting to see what she would do with it. "I might be able to fix it," she said, her mind already working through the mechanics. "If I had the right tools. And a piece of tin." For the first time, a flicker of something new crossed his face. It wasn't a smile, but the hard lines around his eyes seemed to soften almost imperceptibly. "There's a scrap pile behind the barn, and my tools are in there. You're welcome to them." And so their life began. It was a partnership forged in silence, a domesticity defined by shared tasks rather than shared affections. They did not speak of marriage, or the future, or the arrangement that had brought her 1,000 miles from home. They were two people sharing a roof, each with their own work. His was the world outside the cabin door, the fences, the livestock, the endless demands of the land. Hers was the world within. They did not sleep together. The closed door to her small room was a boundary as respected as a fence line. Each morning, she would rise before dawn to find he was already gone. A stack of freshly split wood left for her by the stove. She spent her first days in a frenzy of activity, a quiet war against the cabin's bachelor austerity. She aired out the musty bedding, scrubbed the floors with lye soap and water hauled from the well, and took down the burlap sacks that served as curtains, replacing them with the plain muslin she'd brought in her trunk. She found the scrap of tin Luke had mentioned and, using his files and pliers, fashioned a new damper for the oven. It was clumsy, but it worked. The first loaf of bread she baked in it rose high and even, its crust a perfect golden brown. She said nothing when she placed it on the table that evening, but when he took a slice, he paused for a moment after the first bite, a look of quiet consideration on his face. Evenings were the stillest time. They would eat at the big table. The only sounds, the scrape of forks on tin plates and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. The silence was a living thing, a third presence at the table. It was not the awkward, strained silence of the Gables parlor, filled with unspoken judgments. This was a different quiet, vast and elemental. Like the landscape outside, it was a silence that left room for thought. Clara found herself watching him across the table in the flickering firelight. She watched his hands, large and calloused, but gentle as he handled a piece of bread. She watched the way he ate, with a slow, deliberate focus, as if every meal was a provision against a long winter. He rarely met her gaze, keeping his eyes on his plate, but she often felt the weight of his attention. One evening, a week after her arrival, she found herself staring into the fire, her fork forgotten in her hand. Her mind had drifted back to Kansas, to the look on Thomas's face as he turned away from her, the stinging shame of his mother's words. Asterisk. Not feminine, not soft enough. She felt the old, familiar ache of inadequacy, a cold stone in her stomach. Who was she? Really a woman who could mend a stove and bake bread? Yes, but was that all? Was that enough to build a life on? She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice the silence had changed, that the sound of his chewing had stopped. A sense of being watched pulled her back to the present. She looked up, and her eyes met his across the table. He was looking at her, his fork resting on his plate, and his gaze was not vacant. It was focused, intent, his brow furrowed slightly. It was the look of a man trying to solve a puzzle. He wasn't looking at her face, her hair, her dress. He was looking asterisk at her asterisk, at the quiet, sorrowful stillness that had claimed her. He had noticed her absence, the moment she had retreated into the private, wounded country of her own mind. The instant their eyes met, he looked away, down at his plate, and picked up his fork again as if nothing had happened. But the moment lingered. It was a small thing. A glance held a second too long, but it shifted the foundation of their quiet arrangement. He was not just sharing his cabin with her. He was paying attention. He saw her, not just as a pair of capable hands, but as a person whose silences had length and depth and meaning. And in the quiet walls of his sturdy, solitary house, to be truly seen felt more intimate than any touch. For 2 weeks, the cabin on the ridge was Clara's entire world. Its quiet walls and the vast, silent expanse of the Montana wilderness were the only judges of her existence. She fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, a life measured in loaves of bread, buckets of water, and the slow, steady work of turning a house into a home. The jagged edges of her loneliness began to smooth over, replaced by a sense of purpose. Here, her capability was not a flaw, it was the currency of survival. But the real world, with its whispers and its judgments, could not be kept at bay forever. Their supply of flour was dwindling, and the salt crock was nearly empty. "I'll need to go to town," she announced one evening over their silent supper. Luke looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "I can go." "It's no trouble," she said, her tone more resolute than she felt. "I'm the one who knows what's needed. Besides," she added, a touch of pride in her voice, "you said the tools in the barn were mine to use. Your axe needs sharpening, and I saw a good whetstone at the mercantile when I arrived." He considered her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. He seemed to understand that this was about more than flour and a whetstone. It was about her claiming a piece of this life, about not being a recluse hidden on his mountain. He gave a single, slow nod. "The bay mare is steady. She'll carry the sacks for you." The next morning, she rode down the familiar path, the air crisp and cold. The town looked different in the clear, bright sunlight than it had under the veil of rain. It seemed smaller, more exposed. As she tethered the mare in front of the mercantile, she felt a prickle of awareness, the sensation of being watched. A curtain twitched. 2 men talking on the boardwalk fell silent as she passed, their eyes following her. She was no longer just a strange woman who had appeared in the mud. She was now Remington's woman, a figure of intense local speculation. A small bell tinkled as she pushed open the mercantile door. The interior was a cavern of scents and shadows. It smelled of coffee beans and cured leather, of molasses and tobacco and the sharp, clean scent of new calico fabric. Sacks of flour and sugar were stacked high against one wall, beside barrels of pickles and salted fish, shelves groaned with tinned goods, patent medicines, and all the small necessities of frontier life. A woman stood behind the long wooden counter, polishing a set of scales. She was a stout woman in a starched white apron, with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to strain the skin of her face. This was Mrs. Pritchard, the proprietor, and the undisputed hub of all town gossip. "Morning," she said, her voice brisk. Her eyes swept over Clara, taking in her simple dress, her capable hands, and the unmistakable air of solitude that clung to her. "What can I get for you?" "Good morning," Clara replied, her voice steady. 20 pounds of flour, 5 of sugar, a block of salt, and a bar of lye soap, please." As Mrs. Pritchard began scooping flour into a cloth sack, the questions began, casual and pointed, getting settled up on the ridge. "Are you? It's a hard place for a woman alone." "I'm not alone," Clara stated simply. "Of course, dear Mrs. Pritchard said, a thin smile touching her lips. "You've got Mr. Remington, but he's a quiet one. Isn't he not much for company since his first wife passed?" She paused, her hands still in the flour, her sharp eyes fixed on Clara. "You know about his first wife. I suppose Mary." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He mentioned he was a widower. "Oh, she was a pretty little thing," Mrs. Pritchard sighed, a hint of theatrical sadness in her voice. "Came from back east, hair like spun gold, but so delicate. The winters up here, the loneliness, it was too much for her. Wasted away to nothing." She tied the top of the flour sack with a practiced twist. "A man like Luke needs a strong back and a pair of hands that ain't afraid of work. That's for certain." She moved on to the sugar, her tone shifting from feigned sympathy to something harder, a piece of unsolicited, woman-to-woman advice. "He's a good man, Luke Remington, honest as the day is long, but he's a man who has already buried a wife. He's not looking for another one." Clara stood perfectly still, her hands resting on the cool wood of the counter. She could feel the woman's words landing like small, sharp stones. Mrs. Pritchard finished weighing the sugar and began wrapping the salt block. She didn't look at Clara as she delivered the final, killing blow. She set it to the block of salt, as if imparting a piece of common, irrefutable wisdom. "He just needed a woman to keep the house in order. Dearie, someone to cook the meals and mend the clothes. It's a fair arrangement, I suppose, but you shouldn't get any other ideas. Men like Luke Remington don't marry women like you. Women like you." The phrase echoed in the silent store, a perfect, brutal reflection of the words that had sent her fleeing from Kansas. Not feminine, not delicate. A woman who could ride a horse and mend a fence and stand tall in the face of a challenge. A woman who was capable, strong, and therefore, it seemed unmarriageable, unlovable. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, but her expression remained a placid mask. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her pain. She watched as Mrs. Pritchard finished wrapping her goods, her movements neat and efficient. "Will that be all?" the woman asked, her tone once again brisk and businesslike. The execution complete. "And the whetstone, please," Clara said, her voice a ghost of its usual strength. She paid her bill, the coins clinking softly on the counter. She gathered her packages. The 20-pound sack of flour was heavy, but she hoisted it to her shoulder without a visible sign of strain. She would not ask for help. She would not show weakness. She turned and walked out of the store, the little bell marking her exit with a cheerful, mocking tinkle. She did not look back. The ride home was a silent agony. The weight of the flour sack on the mare behind her was nothing compared to the weight of Mrs. Pritchard's words on her soul. They had confirmed her deepest, most secret fear that her arrangement with Luke was one of pure utility. He hadn't wanted a wife, he'd wanted a housekeeper, a partner for life's work. His notice had said, and what was she? If not a worker, she had answered his advertisement for a baker and a fence mender, and he had hired her for the position. There was no room in such a contract for affection, for tenderness, for love. That night, the cabin felt different. The quiet that had once been a comfort now seemed to press in on her, amplifying the hollowness inside. Luke was even more silent than usual, as if sensing the wall she had erected around herself. After he had retired to his bed on the other side of the main room, Clara remained at the table, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The orange glow illuminated the grain of the wooden table, the calluses on her own hands. These were the hands of a woman who worked. They were not the pale, soft hands of a beloved wife. They were the hands of a hired woman. Mrs. Pritchard's words intertwined with the ghost of Mrs. Gable's voice, creating a suffocating chorus of condemnation. Asterisk. A man needs a wife who is a comfort, a delicate flower. Men like that don't marry women like you. She rested her forehead in her hands, the rough texture of her skin a testament to her failure. All her life, she had been praised for her intelligence, her resilience, her strength. But what good were those things if they made her unfit for the one thing she secretly, desperately craved to be wanted not just for what she could do, but for who she was? She looked at the closed door of her small bedroom, and then toward the quiet lump under the blankets that was Luke. A chasm of silence and unspoken truths lay between them. She was a stranger in his house, a cog in the machinery of his life. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She angrily wiped it away. A woman like her wasn't supposed to cry. She was supposed to be strong. But in the deep, lonely dark of the Montana night, she allowed herself to ask the question that had haunted her for years, the question that now had a new, sharper edge. If she was not beautiful enough to be cherished, not delicate enough to be protected, not soft enough to be a comfort, was she enough to be loved? The days that followed were carved from ice. A brittle silence settled over the cabin, colder and more profound than the silences that had come before. Mrs. Pritchard's words had become a pane of glass between Clara and Luke, distorting every glance, muffling every sound. Clara performed her duties with a quiet, fierce efficiency, her movements precise and contained. She was the hired woman. She would earn her keep. Luke, in turn, retreated even further into himself. He seemed to sense the new distance, the wall she had built, but he did not know how to breach it. He would leave before she rose and return after dusk, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical labor. The weather mirrored the chill between them. The sky became a low, oppressive ceiling of bruised gray clouds. The wind, which had been a whisper, rose to a mournful moan that rattled the single window pane and sifted drafts through the chinking in the logs. The snow began without warning. One moment, the world was gray and still. The next, it was a swirling chaos of white. It was not a gentle, picturesque snowfall. It was an assault, a blizzard that descended from the mountains with the speed and fury of an invading army. The wind shrieked, tearing at the cabin, and the snow came down not in flakes, but in dense, blinding sheets that erased the landscape, swallowing the barn, the corrals, and the trees in a churning vortex. They were inside, trapped by the storm's sudden violence. Luke was mending a piece of tack by the fire, his hands moving with slow, practiced motions. Clara sat at the table, patching one of his shirts, her stitches small and even. The only sounds were the roar of the wind outside and the hiss and crackle of the logs in the hearth. The air was thick with unspoken things. Then came a sound that ripped through the howl of the storm, a sharp, violent crack, like a rifle shot fired next to the ear. It was followed instantly by a deep, groaning roar of tortured wood and the heavy final asterisk, whump asterisk of a massive impact. Luke was on his feet in an instant, his head cocked, his body tense. "The barn," he said, his voice a low growl. Clara's needle froze in the fabric. She looked from Luke's grim face to the window, which was nothing but a sheet of swirling white. The sound had been one of catastrophic failure. Without another word, Luke grabbed his heaviest sheepskin coat from its peg, pulled on his hat, and headed for the door. He was a man moving to save the foundations of his world. Clara watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mrs." Pritchard's voice whispered in her ear, asterisk, he just needed a woman to keep the house in order. Her role was here, inside, by the fire. Her job was to keep the cabin warm, to have a meal ready. A delicate flower would have stayed. A hired woman would have known her place. But as the door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the brief, violent influx of wind and snow, she couldn't stay. She wasn't thinking about their arrangement, about her broken heart, or about the town's judgment. She was thinking of the bay mare, of the milk cow, of the sheer, overwhelming violence of that sound. She was thinking of Luke, alone in that maelstrom. Her body moved before her mind had made a conscious choice. She threw down the shirt, grabbed her own thin wool coat and a thick shawl, and, without hesitating, pulled Luke's spare coat, the one he'd given her that first day in the livery, from its peg. It was heavier, warmer, practical. She wrapped the shawl around her head and face, pulled on the heavy coat, and plunged out the door into the blizzard. The force of the wind was a physical blow. It stole her breath and tried to force her backward. The snow was a million tiny, frozen needles against the exposed skin of her cheeks. She could see nothing, only a churning wall of white. For a terrifying moment, she was completely disoriented. Then, she saw a faint, moving smudge of darkness ahead. Luke, already halfway to the barn, fighting his way through the gathering drifts. She lowered her head and pushed forward, following him into the heart of the storm. The scene at the barn was one of devastation. A massive pine tree on the edge of the clearing, weakened by the wind, had snapped and fallen, crashing directly onto the corner of the barn. The main roof beam had splintered, and a whole section of the roof had collapsed inward, leaving a gaping wound open to the raging storm. Snow was already pouring into the barn, covering the hay and threatening the animals who were huddled at the far end, their eyes wide with terror. Luke was already there, a frantic energy in his movements. He was trying to heave a massive, splintered section of the main beam that was pinning the barn door shut, preventing it from opening more than a few inches. He was one man against an impossible weight. "Luke!" she screamed, her voice snatched away by the wind. He turned, his face a mask of snow and shock at seeing her there. Disapproval warred with desperation in his eyes. "Go back to the house," he yelled, the words barely audible. "You can't do it alone," she screamed back, wading through the deepening snow to his side. There was no time to argue. She could see the remaining structure groaning under the weight of the snow and the pressure of the fallen tree. If they didn't relieve the pressure, the whole barn could go. She grabbed hold of the beam beside him. The wood was rough, icy, and impossibly heavy. Together she yelled, "On 3, 1, 2, 3. They threw their combined weight into it. The beam groaned, resisted. For a moment, nothing happened. Clara dug her heels in, her muscles screaming in protest, the brutal cold forgotten in the fire of exertion. She could feel Luke's body beside her, a solid wall of straining muscle. They were no longer a man and a woman separated by silence. They were two bodies with a single, desperate purpose. Again he roared. They heaved again. This time, the beam shifted, scraping a few precious inches across the frozen ground. The animals inside, sensing the change, began to panic, their frightened calls adding to the cacophony. They worked in a frantic, breathless rhythm, their movements synchronized by necessity. They were a single machine, fueled by adrenaline and the will to survive. The world shrank to the weight of the wood, the burn in their muscles, and the roar of the wind. Inch by agonizing inch, they moved the beam, clearing a path to the door. Finally, it was enough. The door could open, but as Luke surged forward to wrench it wide, Clara, exhausted and off balance, took a step back. Her boot heel came down on a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. Her feet went out from under her with shocking speed. A small cry escaped her lips as she fell backward, her arms flailing for a hold that wasn't there. Luke moved faster than she could have imagined. He abandoned the door, spinning around and lunging for her. His arms didn't just catch her, they wrapped around her like iron bands, yanking her forward and crushing her against his chest. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. He held her, his grip almost painfully tight. One arm was clamped around her waist, the other around her shoulders, holding her so close she could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart against her own. Her face was buried in the rough, snow-caked wool of his coat, and all she could smell was wet wool, pine, and the scent of him. All she could hear was the storm and the sound of their own ragged, desperate breaths mingling in the frozen air. It was not a gentle or romantic embrace. It was the hold of a man clinging to an anchor in a world that was trying to tear him loose. He held her as if she were the last solid thing on earth, his body a shield against the wind and the falling snow. They stood like that for a long, silent moment, locked together in the heart of the blizzard. Clara was too stunned to move, her mind reeling from the fall and the shocking, fierce intimacy of his hold. Then he spoke, his voice a raw, broken whisper against her hair, the words torn from a place of deep, hidden pain. "I've let too many people go," he breathed, his voice ragged with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He clutched her tighter, a shudder running through his powerful frame. "I'm not letting you go." The world snapped back into focus with the shriek of the wind. Luke's words, raw and elemental, hung in the frozen air between them. "I'm not letting you go." They were a brand against the cold, a statement so contrary to her entire life's experience that her mind could not immediately process them. His arms were a cage of desperate strength, and for a dizzying, terrifying second, Clara felt not like a partner, but a possession. But the moment was shattered by a fresh groan from the wounded barn and a terrified whinny from within. The immediate, life-or-death reality of their situation broke the spell. Luke released her as abruptly as he had grabbed her, his face a grim mask of resolve. The brief, raw connection was severed, and they were once again two people fighting a storm. "The animals!" he yelled, his voice all command. "We have to get them out." There was no more time for shock or confusion. Clara nodded, her own fear replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. This was a problem to be solved. This was work to be done. They forced the damaged door open, fighting against the wind that tried to rip it from its remaining hinge. Inside, the barn was a scene of chaos. Snow swirled through the gaping hole in the roof, and the wind howled through the splintered timbers. The bay mare, the milk cow, and two calves were huddled in the far corner, their eyes wide and white in the gloom. What followed was a blur of frantic, coordinated effort. Luke moved with a desperate, focused energy, untying the animals, his voice a low, calming rumble that somehow cut through the storm's fury. Clara, without being asked, grabbed a pitchfork and began clearing a path through the debris and gathering snow, her movement swift and efficient. She threw open the gate to the smaller, sturdier stable, used for sick animals, a structure that had, by sheer luck, been shielded by the main barn and remained unscathed. One by one, they led the terrified animals across the short, treacherous distance between the two buildings. The wind tore at them, trying to spin the creatures around, and the snow blinded them. At one point, the milk cow balked, planting its hooves and refusing to move. Luke pushed from behind while Clara took it by the halter, her face pressed against its neck. her voice speaking the same nonsensical, soothing words her father had always used. She was not a delicate woman, but she knew the language of frightened animals. She knew how to be a point of calm in a storm. When the last calf was safely inside the small stable, its door barred against the blizzard, they stood for a moment in the relative quiet, their chests heaving, their bodies trembling with cold and exertion. They had done it. They had saved his livelihood. They had saved their future. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, stumbling retreat. The snow was now well past their ankles, and every step was a battle. The warmth and light of the cabin window was a distant, longed-for beacon. When they finally fell through the door, slamming it shut against the screaming wind, the silence and warmth of the room were a physical shock. They stood there for a long moment, dripping and gasping, encased in shells of snow and ice. Clara's shawl was a frozen board, and her hair, where it had escaped, was stiff with ice. Luke's hat and the shoulders of his coat were piled high with snow. He looked not like a man, but a mountain. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, they began to shed their frozen outer layers. They worked in a shared, exhausted silence, piling the wet coats and shawls near the hearth to dry. Luke added more logs to the fire, and it roared to life, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The heat was a painful, blessed thing on their frozen skin. He put a pot of coffee on the stove, and the rich, bitter smell soon filled the small cabin. He handed her a steaming mug, and she took it in her trembling hands, the ceramic a searing, welcome heat against her palms. She sank into one of the chairs at the table, her body so profoundly tired it felt boneless. Luke took the other chair, his own large hands wrapped around his mug. The storm raged outside, but inside, the world had shrunk to this small circle of firelight. The pane of glass that had been between them for weeks had been shattered by the storm, and his words, spoken in the chaos, were still there, lying on the table between them. "I'm not letting you go." Clara stared into the black coffee, watching the steam curl and dissipate. She had to understand. She had to know what those words meant, spoken by a man who had barely offered her more than a dozen sentences in a month. It was she who broke the silence, her voice quiet and rough. "In Kansas," she began, not looking at him, but at the reflection of the fire in her mug. "I was to be married." Luke said nothing. He did not move. He simply listened, his stillness an invitation. His name was Thomas. His family was well regarded. She took a sip of the hot coffee, the liquid burning a trail down to the cold knot in her stomach. He was a kind man, in his way. But his mother, she believed a wife should be an ornament, something soft and pleasing to the eye. She said I was too tall, that my hands were too capable, that my opinions were too solid. She finally risked a glance at him. He was staring into the fire, his profile carved by the orange light. He seemed a world away, yet she had never felt him to be closer. "The engagement ended because I wasn't feminine enough. I didn't blush at the right times. I didn't know how to appear helpless. I knew how to reset a fence post, but I didn't know how to bow." The word came out with a bitter taste. "Everything that made me useful on my father's farm made me unsuitable as a wife. Every man I ever knew, they all wanted the same thing. A woman who would make them feel strong by being weak, someone pretty and shy, who would lean on them and look up at them." She fell silent. The story told, it sounded so small and pathetic here, in this cabin where they had just fought a literal battle for survival. But it was the truth of her life. It was the wound that had driven her across the country. She had laid it bare on the table, a pitiful, broken thing. Now, she waited for his judgment. She expected him to say nothing, to retreat back into his silence, leaving her exposed and foolish. Luke remained still for a long time, staring into the flames. The only sounds were the wind and the fire. The silence stretched, becoming taut and heavy. Clara's heart sank. She had made a mistake. She had burdened him with her trivial, womanly sorrows. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, as deep and steady as the earth beneath the cabin. He did not look at her. He spoke to the fire. "Out there," he began, his voice rough. "Just now, in the storm, a woman who knows how to bow, she'd have been broken, blown away." He turned his head then, and his gray eyes, clear and serious, met hers. The intensity of his gaze held her fast. "I don't need a girl who knows how to bow. Clara, I need a woman who knows how to stand when the wind blows hard." The words landed not in her ears, but in the very core of her being. They were a validation so complete, so profound, it almost took her breath away. He was not just accepting her strength. He was telling her it was a virtue, a necessity. He was telling her that the very qualities that had made her an outcast in Kansas were the ones that gave her value here. He looked back at the fire, a shadow of old pain crossing his face. "My Mary, my first wife. She was from back east. She was everything those men wanted, gentle, soft. She knew how to bow. And this land, it broke her. The wind was too strong." He said it not as a criticism, but as a statement of unbearable fact, a tragedy. He fell silent again. But the cabin was no longer filled with distance. It was filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. He had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time, not as a pair of hands or a solution to a problem, but as the woman she was. And he had not found her lacking. The exhaustion of the day settled over them, a heavy, final blanket. Without another word, they rose. He went to his bed on one side of the room, and she went to her small room on the other, closing the door behind her. There was no question of anything else. The intimacy that had passed between them was too new, too fragile, for a physical touch. Clara lay on her narrow cot, her body aching, but her mind strangely, wonderfully still. She could still feel the phantom grip of his arms, hear the ragged whisper of his voice. I need a woman who knows how to stand. Sometime later, in the deep of the night, she rose and went to her small window. The wind had lessened its fury, though the snow still fell in a thick, silent curtain. And then she saw it. On the post of the small porch, a single lantern was lit, throwing a small, defiant circle of golden light into the vast, swirling darkness. It was a beacon against the storm, a promise of watchfulness. He had left a light on for her. It was not a declaration of love, but it was something more real, more true to the man he was. It was a silent, steady promise, shining in the heart of the storm. He was standing guard. The storm broke more than just the barn roof. It broke the silence. In the weeks that followed, as they worked side by side to clear the debris and rebuild the damaged structure, a new language formed between them. It was a language spoken not in words, but in shared labor. It was in the way he passed her a hammer without being asked, anticipating her need. It was in the way she brought him a cup of hot coffee at midday, knowing the cold had seeped into his bones. The vast, empty spaces in their conversations were no longer filled with distance, but with a quiet, humming accord. His words, spoken in the blizzard, were a foundation upon which this new, fragile structure was being built. I need a woman who knows how to stand. The end of the month approached, and with it, the town's monthly social gathering. It was held in the small church, the only building in Griffin's Bluff large enough to hold the scattered population of ranchers and miners who came down from the mountains for supplies and society. Clara assumed it was an event they would ignore, another of the town things Luke avoided. She was surprised when he brought it up one evening as she was clearing the supper dishes. "They'll have a social at the church on Saturday," he said, his eyes fixed on the worn handle of his knife. "Music, food. People come from all over the county." Clara paused, a dishcloth in her hand. "I imagine it's quite the event." He finally looked up, his gaze direct. "We should go." The words hung in the air. Asterisk, we, asterisk. It was the first time he had used the word to describe them as a social unit, as something that existed beyond the boundaries of the ranch. Clara's heart gave a nervous flutter. To go into town with him would be a public declaration of something. She wasn't sure what. It would mean facing the whispers again, facing the sharp, knowing eyes of Mrs. Pritchard. I don't know, she began, the memory of the mercantile still a fresh sting. I'm not much for socials. They'll talk whether we go or not, Luke said, his voice low and steady, as if he had read her mind. I'd rather they talk to our faces than to our backs. He stood up from the table, a clear end to the discussion. We'll go. On Saturday evening, Clara put on her best dress, the dark blue serge she had arrived in. She had washed and pressed it carefully, and she had spent an hour braiding her hair into a neat, dignified coronet. She looked in the small, warped mirror and saw a woman who was plain, tall, and resolute. She was not a delicate flower, but she was, as Luke had said, a woman who could stand. That would have to be enough. Luke was waiting for her on the porch, holding the reins of the bay mare, which he had hitched to a small buckboard wagon. He had put on a clean shirt and a string tie, and the formality of it, so contrary to his usual rough work clothes, was a startling, touching gesture. He didn't say she looked nice. He didn't comment on her appearance at all. He just held out a hand to help her up onto the wagon seat, his grip firm and warm. The church was aglow, its windows casting warm yellow rectangles onto the hard-packed dirt outside. The sound of a lively fiddle tune and the hum of dozens of conversations spilled out into the crisp night air. As they walked through the door, a hush fell over the room. Every head turned. Clara felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. She could see Mrs. Pritchard standing with a group of women, her expression a mixture of surprise and sharp disapproval. Clara's first instinct was to shrink, to look at the floorboards, to make herself small. But then she felt Luke's presence beside her, solid and unmoving as a mountain. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking straight ahead, his expression calm, his shoulders back. He was not ashamed to be there with her, drawing strength from his stillness. Clara lifted her chin and met the stares of the townspeople, her gaze polite but unwavering. They moved through the room, accepting quiet, hesitant greetings. The men nodded to Luke with a new, grudging respect. The women watched Clara with an intense, assessing curiosity. It was a gauntlet, but this time, she was not walking it alone. After a while, the fiddler, a wiry old man with a long white beard, slowed the tempo. The lively reel gave way to the sweet, sad strains of a waltz. Couples began to move toward the cleared space in the center of the room, the men bowing, the women curtsying, their movements practiced and familiar. Clara stood by the wall, watching them, a familiar ache in her heart. She had always hated dancing. At her height, she'd felt like a clumsy giant, towering over her partners, always terrified of stepping on their feet. The memory of her last dance with Thomas, his subtle, pained winces at her awkwardness, was a small, sharp humiliation. And then, Luke turned to her. He didn't say a word. He simply raised his hand, holding it out to her in the open space between them. It was a question, an invitation, and a challenge, all in one simple, profound gesture. The room seemed to fade away. All Clara could see was his hand large, calloused, the hand of a man who worked the land. It was the same hand that had offered her his coat, the same hand that had pulled her from the snow. Her own hands felt suddenly cold and clumsy. "Luke," she whispered, her throat tight, "I can't. I'm a terrible dancer. Truly, it was a confession of her oldest, deepest inadequacy." Luke's expression did not change. His hand remained suspended in the air between them. He looked into her eyes, and his voice was so low only she could hear it over the music. "Then just stand with me." It was not a dismissal of her fear. It was an answer to it. He wasn't asking her to be graceful. He wasn't asking her to be someone she was not. He was asking her to stand with him, in the center of the room, in the full view of everyone. Slowly, as if in a dream, she raised her hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and sure. He led her onto the floor. The whispers in the room became a collective, audible gasp. Luke Remington, the widower recluse, was taking his hired woman to dance. He put his other hand gently on her waist, and he drew her closer. She rested her free hand on his shoulder, the wool of his coat solid beneath her palm. They stood there for a moment as the music swelled, two still figures in a sea of swirling couples. And then they began to move. It wasn't a dance, not really. They didn't twirl or glide. They simply stepped, slowly, carefully, in time with the music. A simple box step, a quiet shuffle on the worn wooden floor. Luke led with a steady, subtle pressure, his movements as economical and deliberate as everything else he did. He was not a gifted dancer, but he was a solid, unwavering partner. Clara kept her eyes on his. Her entire life, during the few times she'd been forced to dance, she had stared at her feet, praying they wouldn't betray her. But now, she didn't look down. She couldn't. His gaze held her, steady and calm. For the first time in her life, she was looking at her partner eye to eye. She was not looking up at him in supplication, nor was he looking down at her in possession. Her height, the thing that had always been a source of shame, was now the very thing that made this moment possible. They were level. They were equals. The music swirled around them. The curious stares of the townspeople faded into a meaningless blur. The only thing that was real was the steady strength of the man holding her, and the quiet, revolutionary truth she saw in his eyes. In the center of that crowded room, they turned slowly. Two solitary figures who had found their center in each other. No one bowed. The ride home was a journey through a changed world. The moon had risen, full and luminous, bathing the landscape in a stark, ethereal light. Every rock and pine tree was etched in silver and shadow. The air was cold and still. The only sounds were the steady clopping of the mare's hooves on the hard-packed trail and the rhythmic creak of the buckboard's wheels. They sat side by side on the narrow seat, not touching, but the space between them was no longer an empty void. It was charged, alive with the memory of their dance, of his hand in hers, of their eyes meeting on a level plane. Clara was intensely aware of him, of the solid shape of his shoulders so near her own, of the quiet, steady rhythm of his breathing. The silence was not one of distance or of comfort, but of profound, unspoken anticipation. They had faced the town together, and in doing so, had drawn a circle around themselves, defining them as a unit. But Clara knew it was a circle drawn in the dust, easily blurred, easily erased. His actions had spoken of partnership, of solidarity, but her heart, scarred by a lifetime of rejection, needed to hear the words. The old wound, torn open by Mrs. Pritchard, still ached with a dull, persistent throb. She had been deemed enough to stand with in a storm, enough to stand with in a crowded room, but in the quiet, desperate chambers of her own heart, the final, terrifying question remained. They were halfway up the ridge, on a turn in the trail that offered a sweeping view of the valley below, when Clara found her voice. "Luke," she said, her voice quiet, "could we stop here just for a moment?" He pulled back on the reins without question, the mare coming to a halt. He looked at her, his face half in shadow, half in the stark moonlight, his expression questioning but patient. She didn't offer an explanation. She simply slid down from the buckboard, her skirts whispering against the dry ground. She walked to the edge of the trail and stood looking out over the sleeping world. The lights of Griffin's Bluff were a small, scattered handful of embers in the vast, silvered darkness. It looked so small from up here, so insignificant. All of its whispers and judgments seemed to shrink under the immense, silent gaze of the moon. She heard the soft thud of Luke's boots on the ground behind her. He came to stand beside her, not too close, respecting her space. He followed her gaze out into the valley. Waiting. He was a man who knew how to wait. The cold night air was a sharp, clean ache in her lungs. This was it. The precipice. She had to ask. If she didn't ask now, in the honesty of this moonlight, she would spend the rest of her life wondering, building her home on a foundation of sand. She would forever be the hired woman, waiting for her contract to be terminated. She turned to face him. He was taller than she was, but only by a few inches, standing on the slight rise of the trail's edge. Their eyes were almost perfectly level. She saw her own reflection, small and pale, in the dark pools of his pupils. "All my life," she began, the words tasting of rust, of old, unshed tears, "I have been told what I am not delicate enough, not pretty enough, not soft enough." She took a ragged breath, the confession of a lifetime pouring out of her. "I have been weighed and measured by men and their mothers, and I have always been found wanting. I was sent away because I was not the right kind of woman." Her voice trembled, but she did not let it break. She held his gaze, forcing him to see the truth of her, the raw, unvarnished fear that she had hidden for so long. "So I came here because you asked for none of those things. You asked for bread that rises and for hands that can mend a fence. And I can do those things. I can work. I can stand in a storm. I can face down a room full of whispers. If you are standing there with me." She paused, gathering all of her courage for the final, terrifying leap. "But what if that is all I am? A partner for the work, a body to help fight the storms. What if, when all the work is done, and the wind is quiet, and you look at me here, in the moonlight, what if I'm not enough?" The question she had never dared to ask anyone, fell into the vast, silent night. It was the summation of every fear she had ever known. It was a plea, a demand, a bearing of her soul. Luke did not answer right away. The silence that followed was the most profound she had ever experienced. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of her words, the weight of her life. He simply looked at her, his face unreadable in the moonlight, his gray eyes searching hers. She could see him thinking, considering not just her words, but the lifetime of pain behind them. He was not a man for easy platitudes or comforting lies. She had asked for the truth, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he would give it to her. Her heart pounded, each beat a painful thud against her ribs. She felt the old, familiar instinct to retreat, to apologize for her forwardness, to turn and flee back to the safety of the buckboard. Then he moved. He took a single, deliberate step forward, closing the small space between them. The world seemed to hold its breath. He raised his hand, slowly, and he didn't touch her face or her shoulder. He reached for her hand, the one she held clenched into a fist at her side, but he didn't take it. Instead, his fingers, warm and calloused, brushed against the delicate, vulnerable skin of her wrist, where her pulse was beating like a frantic, trapped bird. His touch was feather-light, a question, a point of anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. He held her gaze, his eyes clear and steady in the moonlight, and he spoke. "You are..." 2 words, a single sentence. It was not a poem. It was not a grand declaration. The words were as simple and unadorned as the man who spoke them. They were plain and solid, like stones from his field. But they were everything. They were the answer to the question she had been asking her entire life. They were the refutation of every criticism, every rejection, every whisper. They were the validation she had never known she was starving for. "You are..." The words did not cause a sudden explosion of joy. It was something quieter, deeper and more profound. It was like the first spark catching in a pile of dry kindling on a desperately cold night. A small, fragile beginning that promised warmth, that promised light. A wave of relief so immense it made her feel weightless washed over her. The tight, painful knot of inadequacy she had carried in her chest for as long as she could remember began, for the first time, to loosen its hold. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. She just stood there, her wrist in his light grasp, and let the truth of his words settle into the broken places inside her. She looked into his steady, honest eyes, and for the first time, she believed. He had not said, "You are beautiful." He had not said, "You are perfect." He had looked at all of her height, her strength, her fears, her plain face, and he had answered her deepest question with the simplest, most powerful truth. "You are enough." She knew, in that quiet moment on the moonlit ridge, that she did not have to retreat. She did not have to build her walls any higher. For the first time, with this man, she could lay down her arms. She could be still, and she could stay. The next morning, the world was born anew. The light that filtered through the small cabin window was not the harsh, revealing glare of judgment, but a soft, forgiving gold. When Clara rose and entered the main room, Luke was already at the stove, tending the fire. He turned as she entered, and for the first time, there was no awkwardness in his gaze, no shadow of uncertainty. He looked at her as a man looks at a familiar and welcome part of his morning. "Coffee's hot," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "Thank you," she replied, and the simple words felt different, imbued with a new weight and warmth. They ate their breakfast of oatmeal and coffee in a silence that was wholly transformed. The quiet of the previous weeks had been a space of caution, of questions, of two solitary people orbiting each other. This silence was a shared territory. It was the comfortable, easy quiet of two people who had passed through a crucible together and had come to a place of understanding on the other side. There was nothing that needed to be said. His 2 words on the moonlit ridge had said it all. Clara watched him as he ate, the movements of his hands, the steady set of his jaw. She was not just looking at a rancher, a stranger who had answered her letter. She was looking at the man who had seen the sum of her, with all her perceived flaws and unwomanly strengths, and had not found her lacking. The frantic, lifelong effort to be smaller, softer, prettier, all of it had just stopped. The constant, churning anxiety in the pit of her stomach was gone, replaced by a profound and unfamiliar stillness. She felt rooted, as if the foundation of this small, sturdy cabin had somehow extended up into her own soul. When the meal was over, Luke pushed his chair back from the table. He stood for a moment, a look of quiet decision on his face. He looked at the newly repaired barn roof, visible through the window, then at the orderly shelves where Clara had arranged their supplies. And finally, his gaze came to rest on her. "There's something I want to show you," he said. He led her not outside, but to a door at the far end of the main room, a door she had assumed led to a shallow pantry or a wood closet. It was made of thick, rough planks and fastened with a simple wooden latch. She had never seen him open it. It was a part of his world, and of the cabin's history, that had remained closed to her. He lifted the latch and pulled. The door protested, its leather hinges groaning with long disuse. It swung inward into darkness. A cloud of dust, thick with the scent of ages, billowed out into the main room, dancing like 1,000 tiny ghosts in the morning sunbeams slanting from the window. Luke stepped aside, gesturing for her to look. Clara moved forward and peered into the gloom. It was another room, larger than her own small bedroom. It was filled with the forgotten things of a life. Old barrels were stacked in one corner, a collection of broken tools in another. A heavy, dust-shrouded shape against the far wall might have been a piece of furniture. There was a single window, its glass so thick with grime it was nearly opaque. The room was a tomb of neglect, a space given over to spiders and memories. This was a storeroom, Luke said from behind her. Hasn't been opened in years. He stepped past her into the room, his boots leaving clear prints in the thick layer of dust on the floor. He went directly to the window and, with the heel of his hand, wiped a broad arc across the filthy glass. And then the light poured in. It was not the dim, filtered light of the main cabin. This room faced east, and the full force of the morning sun streamed through the newly cleared glass. A brilliant, golden flood that banished the shadows and set the dust motes ablaze. The light was warm and alive, and it transformed the room instantly. It was no longer a tomb. It was a space of pure, breathtaking potential. In the sudden brightness, she could see the room more clearly. She saw the heavy shape was an old, broken spinning wheel, a ghostly relic of his first wife, Mary. There was a stack of old lumber, a rusted crosscut saw, a wooden chest with a broken lid. It was a room full of things that were broken, forgotten, or no longer had a purpose. Luke stood in the center of a sunbeam, turning to face her. His silhouette was dark against the brilliant light from the window. "The roof is sound," he said, his voice quiet. "Matter of fact, the floorboards are good oak. It's warm in the mornings." He paused, and she knew that this was more than just an inventory of a room. This was an offer. "If you stay, Clara." The words hung in the warm, dusty air. Asterisk, "if you stay." It was a question, but one whose answer they both already knew. "We could clear this out, fix it up. We could make this a sewing room for you, a place for your things." Clara didn't answer immediately. Her gaze moved from the broken spinning wheel to the stack of sound lumber. She looked at the years of dust and at the brilliant, hopeful light pouring through the window. A sewing room, a place of her own, not just a cot in a borrowed space, but a room built for her work, for her future. A room to be created from something old and forgotten. He wasn't offering her a ready-made life. He wasn't promising her a world without hardship or hard work. He was offering her a pile of broken things in a beam of sunlight. He was offering her his trust, his effort, and a share in the building. He was offering her a space to put down her own roots, right beside his. She looked from the room back to him, standing there in the light, his face open and honest, waiting for her answer. She saw the man who had faced the storm, the man who had stood with her in the crowded church, the man who had answered the most important question of her life with 2 simple words. And so, she gave him her answer. There was no kiss, there was no formal proposal, no ring offered on a bended knee. There was only this Clara May Sinclair looked at the dusty, sun-filled room. And then she looked at Luke Remington, and she gave him a single, certain nod. It was not an ending. It was a beginning, the quiet, solid start of a life to be built, board by board, together. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Please let us know in the comments below to connect with fellow fans and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story be heard by even more people, please also press the hype button to show your support.